And right now, I am pleased to be joined in the studio by Howie Hawkins. He is a Green Party candidate for mayor. And thank you for taking some time out. I know it's a busy time of the year, but thanks for taking some time out to talk to us here on Power Perspectives and our listeners.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, well, you want to be mayor. Tell me, what do you think is the current status of Syracuse, and what are your plans as mayor to move it forward?
Well, the status is poverty's growing, crime is too high, the schools are struggling, and we're on the brink of bankruptcy. So if that happens, the State Financial Control Board will come in, and it doesn't matter who's mayor because they will do the budget. And they could even recommend that the city be dissolved into a countywide metro government like the Consensus Commission proposed, and we'd be reduced to a quote-unquote special debt district, paying extra taxes for our unconsolidated, still segregated schools, and for the pensions and health care of our former city employees. So I think the first job of the next mayor is to find the money so we don't go insolvent, go bankrupt. And I believe the two initial sources we should go for is an increase in state revenue sharing. The state used to provide 8% of state revenues to municipalities. It's down to less than 0.5 of 1%. In the 70s, it was 8%. Today, it's less than 0.5 of 1%. That's $72 million a year for the city. If we can just get that up to 1% of state revenues, that would be another $72 million. The structural deficit's $15 to $20 million. That alone would get us out of our fiscal crisis. I also want a progressive tax on income made in the city, not just on residents, but on commuters and absentee landlords, anybody making money in the city, at an average 1% rate. And I graduated, so you wouldn't pay, say, the first $25,000, and you got over $100,000, you might be paying 1.5%. At an average 1%, with a $2.8 billion payroll in the city, that's $28 million. We need home rule from the state for that. So what I think I bring as a candidate for mayor is I've been active in movements for peace, justice, labor, the environment, and independent working class politics since the 1960s. I've got political skills. I've run against Governor Cuomo, and there's about a dozen issues where we were opposed when I ran. He's now on our side. The $15 minimum wage, tuition free at public colleges, the ban on fracking. And actually, if you read the Daily News on a Monday recently, you'd see that he was consulting with the Green Party on energy policy and climate action. So you can disagree during the election, but afterwards you can still advance issues. And I think we can build a coalition of upstate cities, counties, and towns who are all in fiscal distress. And we're paying the highest in the nation property taxes, and go to the state and say, you got to up your revenue sharing. And so I think I got the political skills to pull that kind of change in policy off, and also to unite Syracuse behind progressive reforms, which we can talk about more. But the first job is the next mayor's got to get the city out of a fiscal crisis.
Well, everybody's talking about the fiscal crisis and the crisis in poverty. I mean, Syracuse is number one, and a concentrated poverty, and amongst blacks and Hispanics. What is your view on that, first of all? And second of all, what do you see going forward if you were indeed elected mayor to try to alleviate this problem?
Right. It's not just the city. It's a lot of families have their own personal fiscal crises because they're poor. And my basic approach, if I'm mayor, will be to focus resources and policies on uplifting poor and working class people in this city. And that means we stop giving tax breaks to the big shots, like Destiny USA, which won't pay property taxes till 2035, and entrench low-wage poverty because those jobs out there are minimum wage. They're not enough hours, and they're not secure, so you're in and out of employment. And it was supposed to redevelop the north side or stimulate. What happened was the number of high poverty census tracts has quadrupled since 2000, and most of those are on the north side. So Destiny USA, that's called trickle-down economics. You give money to rich people, they're supposed to invest and create jobs. It don't trickle down or don't trickle out to the neighborhoods. I want to focus those resources directly into the high-poverty neighborhoods. And if we do that, it will address the two top issues on people's minds besides the economic struggles, and that is high crime and struggling schools. We know when you have concentrated poverty, you're going to have high crime and you're going to have schools that struggle. And so if we uplift poor and working class people, the city's going to have lower crime, improved achievement in the schools, and then the place will be attractive to middle class folks and business people, and we can all prosper together. So that's my overall strategic vision. And then there's specific policies I want to implement. For example, the city has on the books since 1973 an equal employment opportunity program. It's supposed to make sure minorities get their fair share of city-funded jobs on contracts. That program is basically the contractors still report their hiring, and it gets filed. Nobody's monitoring it. Nobody's enforcing it. The last time the data was reported was 2008 by the Human Rights Commission. I have the data from 2004 to 2008, and minorities are getting about 1/5 of their proportionate share of those jobs. So we need to overhaul that program, extend it to all, all the contractors. Like Destiny was not covered. Businesses that get tax incentives, tax breaks, aren't covered. It's only direct contracts, so they should be covered, and also the city departments, like the police. We're 37 years after the federal consent decree. They were supposed to have 10% of black officers in every rank. They just this year got to 10% of officers, but not in every rank. Meanwhile, the city's gone from 10% black to almost 50% people of color. So I think that's the first thing. Make sure with the jobs the city's already funding in the departments and with contracts, minorities and city residents are getting their fair share. And then I've called for a Marshall Plan for Syracuse. And that would take resources to rebuild the high poverty districts, affordable housing, better transportation infrastructure, employing people in those neighborhoods to rebuild their neighborhoods. And where we get the funds, if Governor Cuomo with a stroke of a pen can do the Buffalo Billion, and if the Upstate Revitalization Initiative gets $500 million, with part of their mission being to alleviate poverty, there's money there, and we got to put together a proposal and get it funded.
Well, I see construction going on of or renovations of buildings downtown galore. And it seems that they're always upper scale renovations that are getting done. Why isn't this being done in those tracts that are poorer, or those tracts that really need new housing? And what could you do to make sure that happens?
You're right. There's the downtown. A lot of these high-end condos got subsidized. There's the Inner Harbor development, which is all upscale. And what little affordable housing we've built, they put in the poor neighborhoods. So we're further concentrating poverty and segregating ourselves by class, which overlaps with race. So I want to see an inclusionary zoning ordinance. So any new development, any substantially rehabbed housing, you have to have mixed income. So you have a minimum number of affordable units, and given the affordability crisis in this city and how many people are paying more than the federal standard of 30% of their income, about a third of those units should be affordable. And they should also be market rate, so you're not just putting all the low-income housing in the already low-income neighborhoods.
Exactly.
And we're beginning to integrate. And I think we got a great opportunity with I-81 coming down, and we rebuild the old 15th Ward Street community grid. And Syracuse Housing Authority has a plan that would basically double or even triple the number of units in the 27 block area now taken by public housing, rebuild the whole area. All the low-income people there would have a unit, and it would also have market rate units. So professors on the Hill, teachers in the neighborhood, police, fire, accountants, you want to mix it up so poor kids aren't isolated from the resources and opportunities and knowledge that middle-class kids take for granted. And I think that could be a model of what we can extend throughout the city with an inclusionary zoning policy. Okay,
well, you mentioned the I-81, and you must be looking at my notes, because I was definitely going to ask you about that. What option do you think would be best for Syracuse, and what would you do to move that forward?
Well, I've been for the community grid before we called it the community grid. I ran for mayor in 2005 and said we got to take that highway down and rebuild that community, mixed income, mixed use, serviced by public transportation, walkable, and built with energy efficiency and other environmental concerns in mind. And I think the community's come around to that position. And I think that's where we're going. And so we got to take advantage of it. And what the city's got to do is, first of all, the federal land underneath what's now the elevated highway, we need to get the city to get their title to that so they have leverage in the whole process. And then we got to go to the state DOT and say there'll be no project labor agreement unless there are guarantees for city resident and minority hiring, which the Trump administration has just said we're not going to do on federal contracts. Now they'll be channeled through the state DOT. That's where our leverage is. So I think we got to make sure our people benefit, and that we build it as a community for everybody, not another upscale gated community.
Well, a while ago we were talking about poverty, and one of the things that leads to poverty is lack of education. How do you see the Syracuse City School District as give them a grade, and then tell me how would you improve upon that grade?
Well, I think they're doing great with what they've got, and I think the new superintendent, Alsea, is doing a good job. But what we've got is anywhere you go in the country and you concentrate poor kids in schools, you're going to get low standardized test scores, no exceptions. And you will not find any high poverty school districts that get high scores. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King came here, spoke at Syracuse University in 1965 and said, we're dealing with Jim Crow segregation in the South. You have de facto segregation in the North. And if you don't deal with it, you're going to lose generations of children. And for the last 50 years, we have. So I think what the mayor's got to do is start talking about desegregation, not just within our school district. There's some problems that some kids are channeled to Fowler to become barbers and beauticians, tend to be the poor kids. And then we got the Latin school for the middle class kids you got to apply to get into. So we got like the International Baccalaureate program. The last 2 years, those kids are in one wing of the school, segregated from the rest. But the big problem is the difference between the Syracuse school district and adjacent school districts. West Hill, Fayetteville, Manlius, Jamesville, DeWitt. And we got to start talking about having a consolidation of school districts so we can mix the kids up by income. When you do that, the lower class kids' test scores come up, the achievement gap is radically closed. The middle class kids do as well or better. But all the kids do better on other things that are important for life and work and business, and that is intellectual self-confidence, leadership skills, problem solving, creativity, teamwork. And, it's the middle class kids are suffering from, let me put it this way, white affluent people are more segregated from the rest of us than ever in our history. Our housing segregation and school segregation has been increasing, and they're missing out too. So I think that's the argument we take to those school districts. These schools, if we desegregate, will be better for all our kids. And, there are all kinds of other ideas about how to improve the schools, like high-stakes testing to make the teachers and the schools accountable. All that does is prove that the high-poverty schools score low. It punishes the teachers, it punishes the schools, and punishes those neighborhoods and students and teachers just for being poor. And that's not a solution. That's the state policy. And we have 9 out of our 34 public schools are under threat of being taken over by the state next year. That's almost it's more than a quarter of our schools, and handed over to private charter schools, which means there'll be less money for the kids that remain in public school. Those charter schools can send back the troublemakers to the public schools. They do. And the schools will still have the same overhead they had before, so it'll be a financial as well as economic disaster. The mayor doesn't have direct responsibilities in those areas, but I think they have a bully pulpit from which they can make people deal with those issues and start talking about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other big problems here in Syracuse, as in any other metropolitan city, is crime. I know that the police department is understaffed at this point, or that's what they say is going on, that they're understaffed. What would you do if elected mayor to make sure that the police are properly staffed and to try to increase public safety? Because sometimes it doesn't really depend on how many police you have out there on the street. Sometimes it depends on how the community interacts with the police department. So I don't think numbers are, basically the be all and end all to bring down crime. But what are your views on that?
Well, I think you're exactly right on that last point. I've met with Frank Fowler, like the other mayoral candidates are, and he has a PowerPoint where you see the number of calls coming in and responding to calls is increasing, and they're stretched. But I want to lower the need to respond to calls by lowering crime. And the model I want to bring here is what the Green mayor of Richmond, California did between 2006 and 2013, Gail McLaughlin, when she was in office. And she hired a new police chief, and they did a whole new policy. Instead of promoting officers based on tickets written and arrests made, they made them do community policing. Every officer was assigned to a beat to walk, get to know the neighbors, get to know the businesses, and work on solving problems before they got worse, de-escalating conflicts before they got worse. In parallel to that, they had an intensive program of reaching out to the youth that were doing the bad things in the neighborhoods, particularly the shootings. Syracuse crime's been going down in all categories except youth shootings. There was just an AP study on the cover of USA Today that found that we were 6th in the nation for teens injured or killed by firearms since 2014. That's what we've got going up. That's why the perception of crime, and it is real. I hear the gunshots. I live on the south side. I hear them frequently. So we need the equivalent of what Richmond's 100,000 had a higher murder rate than we even did. And they lowered the homicide rate by 75% and property crime rate by 40% by this community policing and youth outreach workers who would go to the youth and say, we know what you're doing. If you keep doing it, you're going to end up in jail. But we've got other opportunities for you. See, these kids are unattached to education or employment. The gang may be a better source of companionship than the family situation they came from, and nobody's showing them any care. So the youth outreach workers go talk to them and hook them up with opportunities. They may need counseling because they've been through a lot of trauma. They may have a drug addiction problem. They may just not have got educated and need to get some basic skills so they can, get into the labor market. Whatever it is, we're there to help. And what they did in Richmond, I think we need to do here. And I would just put it this way. Given our fiscal crisis, all the other candidates are saying we got to hire all these police officers. Last year, there was 261 people on city payroll that made over $100,000. One was the mayor, a few were firefighters, all the rest were police. They're very expensive. For $100,000, you can hire 3 outreach workers. That's 10 cops to get 30 outreach workers. I think that's the first investment we should make, as well as redeploy the officers to do walking the beat. So they get out of their patrol cars and walk around with us. Just that is a deterrent to crime when they're present. The patrol cars, not so much, because they drive by around the corner and whatever bad was about to happen will resume. So that would be my approach. And along with, just this whole thing about investing in the high poverty neighborhoods and reducing the poverty and then desegregating the poverty so it's not concentrated.
Okay. Let's see. What I wanted to ask you about is you've been out knocking on doors, talking to people, forums you've been in. What are people saying to you as what are the problems that need to be solved here in Syracuse, and what are your answers to them?
Well, crime, schools, and the economy are always the perennial issues in Syracuse. I've been knocking on doors for a couple decades. And, some people think it's more police. I mean, that seems like it's a simple answer that really doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't get at the root causes. And the schools, people have different opinions. I know, like on the west side, they're wondering why won't they fix up Blodgett, which has, been on the list for repairs for decades, and it's always sort of, put to the back of the line. And now I think the Joint School Construction Board said they would make a decision on whether to reinvest or just close it down. And I think they're waiting until after the election. They haven't moved on that. Although I think all the candidates are saying, you got to fix Blodgett. So that's what I hear over there on the schools. And as far as the economy goes, I think, when I talk about instead of giving tax breaks to the big shots, we invest in our neighborhoods, people say, yeah. And when I talk about community policing, people say, yeah, I don't know who those officers are. They just drive by. Mm-hmm. And we know, 92% of them live outside the city. So residency, that's something we've talked about, getting in the next union contract, like the fire department initiated, actually, that these officers, if they're going to work for the police department, should live here.
Right.
So those are some of the issues that come up. And, there are a lot of issues in the city. I've said instead of the city responding willy-nilly to private developers who then become de facto the city planners, the city should have a plan. And I think a bold plan, because if we're just everywhere USA with the same, fast food franchises and hotel franchises and parking lots crowding out downtown, 60% of the land is devoted to the car downtown. And what makes downtown, why people come there is the density, and the cars and the parking lots are, reducing that impact. I want to see, besides the community grid, what Emmanuel Carter, a landscape architect up at Syracuse University, called way back in 2004, civic and environmental highways, so that we restore the Onondaga Creek corridor, make it riverfront property. The creek, rather than just being a channel, becomes a natural, restored to its natural course. You have ponds, low-head hydro, biological waste treatment, and you can set up retail, restaurants, and make it a place where people want to gather. And that will be an economic stimulus to the neighborhood. And be given all the abandoned land from abandoned housing down there, we can do urban agriculture. And then the other corridor I would like is to bring the Erie Canal from the Inner Harbor, at least through downtown, and maybe eventually out Erie Boulevard and reconnect in DeWitt. And when I say that, people smile, because if you get on Clinton Square and see the architecture, you know it's built around the canal. And those features would make Syracuse different, unique, and that would make it attractive to businesses, the so-called creative class that we tried to get here, you know, the artists and the technicians and the scientists, the professionals, the young professionals that the, you know, condo housing we subsidized was supposed to bring here. And the theory, that was another trickle-down idea, but it didn't trickle out. So I think those urban design features, basically I want a city department of planning and sustainability that comes up with a plan and then has the private developers bid on our plan rather than us just reacting to their proposals and getting an incoherent plan that really doesn't take the city in a direction we've chosen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in our last few minutes, it's been well known that people haven't been coming out to vote. What would you say to people, especially for this election, why they need to come out and vote?
Well, I've been, you know, knocking on the doors for years, and increasingly people are so alienated from just a sense of powerlessness that my vote doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter who you elect. You can't fight City Hall, and it's a waste of your time and foolish to try. I don't want to be a sucker, you know, and they just want to withdraw, and they look at the nightly news and see the Democrats and Republicans throwing mud at each other on TV nationally, and they just say, I got enough problems. I can't deal with another one. But what I want to do is change the institutions in Syracuse to encourage voting. One of them is take the TNT neighborhood planning councils, which are big sectors encompassing several neighborhoods, and break them down to neighborhood assemblies with real budgets from the city to do local projects in the neighborhood, and with a voice. They should be chiming in on city budget and policy decisions, and people who have a direct voice there where they can feel their power. I'd also like to go to proportional representation. Right now, most districts are one-party district majorities, so it doesn't matter, you know, who you vote for, because it's pretty foregone conclusion who will win that district.
Right.
With proportional representation, where every party gets representation in proportion to the vote, every vote counts for getting your party more representation. So you don't feel it's a wasted vote or a pointless vote. And I think those two institutional changes would encourage more people to vote. And then I think a city that's responsive and doing some creative things, when people say, wait a minute, this is starting to change, I think I'll get engaged. So it's a complicated problem, and it's across the country, and America has the lowest voter turnout of any industrial country, and there are a lot of reasons for it, but I think those two reforms I just proposed will help us in Syracuse get people re-engaged.
Okay, well, November 7th is the big day, and we all encourage you to, once again, as I said at the top, is to make sure you're informed about the issues, what issues are important to you, and then study and make sure that you know what the issues are that the candidates are talking about, and make sure they match up with you. We don't want to tell you who to vote for. I'm sure Mr. Hawkins would like for you to vote for him, but just get out and vote, because the day after, you know, you can't say anything. You can't yell, you can't scream, you can't cry, you can't complain. So please get out and vote. And Howie Hawkins, thank you so much for not for just coming in and talking with us and letting us know what you feel is important for the city of Syracuse, but for all you've done. You've been at this for a while, running for public office and just informing people about things that we need to know about Syracuse and the problems that are going on in Syracuse. And you've been very good at that. And I just want to thank you for that, and wish you luck on November 7th.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, we'll be back with more on Power Perspectives right after this.